Hello everyone, my name is Drew and today I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of Far Cry 5. Now full disclosure, these are my opinions after playing about 10 to 15 hours, so don't consider this my final opinion or anything like that. However, there are a lot of things in this game that I'd like to talk about, and I feel like I've gotten enough of a grasp on the gameplay structure and mechanics and things like that to give you guys a good enough recommendation as to whether you should play it or not. Another thing I have to get out of the way is I honestly can't say I'm the biggest Far Cry fan. Now don't get me wrong, Far Cry 3 was a fantastic game, and Blood Dragon was probably one of my favorite games from the last generation. But other than that, I don't really care for the rest of the series. Far Cry 1 was a flawed and cheesy mess of a game. I'm actually playing through it right now on Twitch, and it's an experience. Far Cry 2 was an ambitious but ultimately boring open world game. Far Cry 4 mostly just seemed like a reskin of Far Cry 3, and Far Cry Primal didn't interest me at all because of its setting. So yeah, there are more Far Cry games in the series that I don't care for than ones that I do, so needless to say, heading into Far Cry 5, I wasn't really that optimistic about my experience. Well, I'm happy to report that most of the worries that I had with Ubisoft's typical tried and true formula of climb this radio tower and find these points on the map isn't as much of a problem here as I thought. The game teaches you pretty quickly that climbing radio towers isn't how this game is going to work anymore, and it's greatly appreciated. Now discovering the map feels organic and things unlock as you find them, and you can even discover places by talking to NPCs, reading signs and magazines, or even by radio chatter that you overhear from the enemy. This heightens the open world experience in a similar way to Assassin's Creed Origins, where I feel drawn into the location rather than just have it be nice window dressing for a bunch of monotonous tasks. Speaking of monotonous tasks, you can expect to find these standard Ubisoft fare here. Outposts, collectibles, random encounters, they're all here. But Far Cry 5 manages to change things up a bit by including meaningful side quests, a surprisingly deep, pun intended, fishing minigame, and an overall reputation system that makes it feel like no matter what you're doing, you're progressing through the story. Far Cry 5 is set up kind of like a mafia or gang territory game. There are 4 sections of the map, each controlled by their own member of the Seed family, which are essentially this game's versions of gang leaders or bosses. In each section, you have to cause enough trouble, do enough damage, and do enough missions to get the attention of that section's particular leader. And once they finally start to poke around and figure out what you're trying to do, that's when you take them out. It deviates a little bit from that, but if that sounds familiar, that's because this has been done quite a few times before, most recently in Mafia 3. In that game, you ended up doing the same tasks over and over again to the point where it just became super repetitive because you were doing side quests, but they were just taking over the same bar or something like that over and over and over again until the boss eventually came out. What eventually happened is all the boss fights against the gang leaders were super interesting, but everything in between was just so repetitive that it got boring after a while, and it forced a lot of people like myself to never finish the game. Thankfully though, Far Cry 5 combats this problem in a few different ways. For one, side quests and main quests are varied and encourage you to play around with different playstyles in the game. Also, these small objectives dotted around the map are just involved enough to keep your attention and not get boring. Yes, outposts and collectibles have been done to death in these Ubisoft games, but for the most part you can completely ignore those objectives if you want to. There are a huge amount of activities that give you reputation in a certain section, so you can just do something else if you don't feel like liberating outposts or doing side quests. You can do something else in the open world to continue on that path on the story. There is a huge amount of freedom in this game, down to how you complete individual objectives all the way up to what order you complete them in. You can do everything from stealthily clear out a base and without it being discovered to bombarding the base from above with a plane or helicopter. Far Cry Sandbox is in full form here, and it keeps the action flowing at a constant pace. Put simply, if you're running out of things to do in this game, you're just not being creative enough. To have fun in this game, you have to challenge yourself to change things up every now and then. It plays best as a jack-of-all-trades simulator where you can do anything you put your mind to rather than forcing people down specific paths or builds. The light RPG mechanics from the other games are still there where you put points towards perks, but everything here feels like it's mostly just there because it needs to be. No story explanation is given for any of your abilities like the tribal tattoo from Far Cry 3. Instead, they feel detached from the rest of the experience, even though they do admittedly make it more fun fun to play, so I'm glad they're there. As far as the rest of the gameplay is concerned, oh man, I don't think I've enjoyed Far Cry's gunplay this much. Every weapon feels meaty and deadly, and there's just a ton of variety here to keep you interested. You can use anything from a big-ass rocket launcher all the way to a shovel that you can actually throw as a spear. The game is just fun to play, and the variety only adds to that. This is Ubisoft's best example of an open-world sandbox to date. There's so much stuff to do and so many different ways to do them that I can't ever see myself getting bored as long as I remind myself to change things up every now and then. But if you're the kind of person who likes to find a playstyle and stick with it throughout the entire experience, then you might get bored here. For example, if you typically go with the silent, stealthy approach with the bow and throwing knives, you will have fun for a few hours. I just don't know if that fun will last the entire experience, since it might get a little repetitive going at every single situation the exact same way. But I guess that's true about most games, so yeah, variety is the spice of life with this game. It's definitely true here, so just try to change things up and challenge yourself to think outside the box every now and then. My chief complaint with the gameplay, though, is how fast it throws everything at you. In Far Cry 3, everything slowly built up until you started decimating the landscape with RPGs and satchel charges. But here, those weapons are available from the word go. Seriously, you can craft satchel charges from the beginning of the game. There's no story explanation or anything like that. You can just craft satchel charges for some reason. Don't get me wrong, I like that the game gives you so many options right out of the gate, but the trade-off is that you never really feel a sense of personal growth or power creep. If within the first 30 minutes of the game I can raid an outpost, get one of the best LMGs in the game, and get a rocket launcher, why would I ever feel more powerful than that moment later on in the game? Especially if I decide that I'm just going to use those weapons for the rest of the game. There's just a huge lack of balance and difficulty here. To be honest, the only real difficult parts for me were the parts when the game took all of your weapons away from you. It's a great change of pace that makes you think on your feet and surprises you, but it is artificial in difficulty, and it kind of does prove my point. This game's point-to-point gameplay is just too damn easy. But I've talked about the gameplay enough. How does the game itself perform? Well, despite the footage that I'm showing you guys of my stream, it's just compressed to hell and doesn't look very good, I'm sure. The game actually looks beautiful on the Xbox One X version. That's the one I'm primarily playing on. It's in 4K and a solid 30 frames per second pretty much throughout. The frame rate does dip occasionally, but that's only when you're like flying around in air vehicles, and honestly during big firefights and stuff like that, I don't notice the dips that much, so I think that is most important. When you're in the heat of the battle, there isn't really that much of a hit to a performance, but keep in mind I am playing on the Xbox One X, so I can't say so much to the rest of the console experience. The only area where I consistently see frame dips is in the arcade mode, but that's user-generated maps, so I really can't blame Ubisoft for that, for not having that optimized, because I mean, how can you optimize user-generated stuff? So I don't blame them for that. Speaking of arcade mode, I just wanted to touch on it briefly here. I think that what Ubisoft has done with this mode is simply fantastic. They've had map builders and playing these maps in their games before, but it hasn't been this extensive and this in-depth and this well thought out. They actively encourage players to test out random maps that are just either brand new or never played before from other players, which really means that this community can thrive and grow. Add to this the fact that random maps are added to the competitive multiplayer pool of maps, and that means that tons of maps are just going to get a lot of exposure, both good and bad. Does this mean that you'll be playing a lot of crap maps in multiplayer? Probably. But does it limit the amount of fun you're going to have with it? Absolutely not. I'm excited to see where this mode goes in the future, and considering Ubisoft's recent history of really supporting games post-launch, I'm actually really excited to see how this community grows and thrives with all the assets and new modes that they're planning on adding to it later on. And the last thing I wanted to touch on here was the story of the game. Now, I don't want to spoil anything, so don't worry about that, but what I will say is that this is the most interesting group of characters since Voss from Far Cry 3. So far, Ubisoft hasn't managed to surpass themselves, but they might get pretty damn close with this cast. Joseph Siege is an incredibly intimidating and unsettling antagonist, and his siblings are just as sadistic. The writing walks the line of satire and realism beautifully, being just believable enough that you can really believe that they would exist. Living in a really religious area of the United States, I've connected to this game way more than I ever expected. It's a perspective that makes the game even more unsettling for me, because it's kind of, I'm talking about how unsettling this game is. While I got my cat. But yeah, it's unsettling to me because it's incredibly realistic to the climate our country's in right now. But I do feel like this aspect is something that will be lost to players outside of the US. To them, this will seem like another ridiculous, over-the-top story that could never really happen. But to me, it feels possible, especially with things like the Waco incident. You know, it feels really grounded. Overall, I'm having a fantastic time with Far Cry 5 and its sandbox. The game is an absolute blast to play, both literally and figuratively. God, I hate myself. Whether you're fishing or liberating an outpost, you're never too far away from the next thing to do. You're never too far away from having fun. Whether that translates to a totally engaging 40-hour experience or something that just kind of devolves into a mindless repetition fest that I don't even finish, I don't know. But I'm honestly optimistic. If you're a fan of Far Cry games, this game is an absolute no-brainer and I can totally recommend it. If you're like me and you really enjoyed Far Cry 3 but not anything else from the franchise, then you could still find a lot to love here. Far Cry 5 is a game that has something for everyone, short of people that just don't like first-person shooters. But if you're on the fence, I would honestly recommend trying it out. I don't think you'll regret it because I know that I don't. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching my Far Cry 5 review. If you want to see more content like this, check out the rest of our channel. Also, I stream on Twitch every single weekday from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern, so come by my Twitch channel and follow me. Once we get to 100 followers, we're going to do a charity stream. It's going to be fun. But yeah, if you want to see more gameplay of games like this and like the older classic games, that's what I play there, so come check it out. But yeah, that's going to be it for me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!